I'm Andrew Masloski with AAM Insight. Today, my guest is Dr. Thomas Barfield, author of the new book, Afghanistan, A Cultural and Political History. Dr. Barfield, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you.
A theme in your book is the ethnic diversity of Afghanistan. So I'd like to know, how has it then remained a unified state given that diversity?
This is a part of a world that's always been multi-ethnic. And the question is, who's going to dominate a system? Who's going to be on the top? Who's going to be on the bottom? Not who's going to be exclusive. So what you find is groups seeking to compete with one another, seeking a better role within a multi-ethnic society, but who are not and have never proposed dividing up the country. So unlike Yugoslavia or the Caucasus or some other places, if we look at Afghan history, recent Afghan history, we don't find a single leader of an ethnic group either threatening to become independent if he didn't get his way, or amalgamating with a neighboring nation where they have co-ethnics. So what we're looking at is a different type of ethnicity which lacks a nationalist component, and hence the people can be extremely practical when it comes to coming to a new political order.
In your book, you also wrote that throughout history, Afghan rulers have tended to think of the Afghan people as a flock of sheep. What does that mean?
Historically, the rulers of Afghanistan were not even members of the ethnic groups that were in Afghanistan. They were conquerors who came in from the outside and ruled, but also they followed an old tradition in Central Asia and much of the Islamic world that rulership was best left in the hands of an elite, and they fought among themselves, but ordinary people had no role in government and certainly had no need to be consulted. Hence, the metaphor that was often made that every flock needed a shepherd, but of course, shepherds did not expect the sheep to baa in their favor to give them power. This is something that began to change in the 19th century when, in order to get rid of the British, Afghan rulers had to mobilize their own population. And it's really in the 19th century the first time we find ordinary people playing a large role in national politics. And from that time on, there's this dilemma of Afghan rulers attempting to mobilize the population in defense of the country, and at the same time, when they succeed, is trying to convince those same people they have no role in government when the king returns. So this is something that for the past 100, 150 years, we've seen has become more and more difficult to do each time. And today, no one would say politically that the Afghan people either conceive of themselves or a flock of sheep, or are willing to accept the power and authority of a single leader the way they might have been 100, 150 years ago.
Along those lines, we saw just last year the presidential election in Afghanistan. Ultimately, Hamid Karzai won that election. But how is political legitimacy conferred in Afghanistan? Is it through elections now, or is there another process that really confers that legitimacy?
In Afghanistan in the past, for 230 years, it was dynastic legitimacy. You had a series of kings of Afghanistan, and they competed among themselves. But the Soviet War and the Civil War undermined that. And the question of who should be the ruler of Afghanistan is now more or less up for grabs. And people are not really sure what makes a ruler legitimate or not. But they've never had a tradition of elections for rulers. The election in 2004 was the first presidential election they'd ever had in the country. They had parliamentary elections, but never this. But as an Afghan friend told me when I congratulated him on a successful election, and this surely must give Karzai legitimacy, he turned to me and said, "Oh, you Americans, you always pray before the meal. We Afghans pray only after we have eaten it." So what I learned from that was that the election had given Karzai the right to compete for legitimacy, and the Afghans would see how well he had done. We Americans and those in the West assumed that the election process in itself provided that legitimacy. Afghans did not.
The current Afghan government, it seems, is highly centralized, the national government. But with Kabul making decisions for many local areas, does that model of governance have a precedent in Afghan history?
Yes, this model has direct precedence. It's the Constitution of 2004 is largely a direct copy of the 1964 Constitution, which was written for a king. So substitute king for president, or president for king, and it's pretty much the same constitution. In other words, we were told this is an old Afghan constitution, it's Afghan tradition. It is. It just happens to be a royal tradition. And perhaps we should have taken a closer look at where this constitution came from, because effectively it's a royal document dressed up a little bit for Republican virtues.
What expectations did Afghans have of the international community after the invasion in 2001 when the Taliban were ultimately toppled? What were they expecting to happen?
The Afghans had very high expectations for the international community after 2001, in part because they had suffered not only from the Russian invasion and occupation, which lasted for 10 years, in which 1 million people were killed, 3 or 4 million people were made refugees. And then after the Soviets left and after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Najibullah regime that had been supported by Moscow also collapsed, but rather than resulting in a new stable form of government, it resulted in 10 years of civil war. And one of the things that happened was that the Afghans recognized that they were involved in a process that they no longer controlled. They could not bring about peace, and they seemed to be suffering perpetual war. So the international invasion was actually popular with many Afghans simply because it ended the civil war. And what they expected us to do was put an end to the warlords that had brought them into that trouble, retire them, so to speak. They hoped that Afghanistan's economic development would be given priority because it's one of the poorest countries, least developed countries in the world. So they hoped that there would be improvements in that. And they hoped that there would be a stable political situation. And unfortunately for them, while they gave it 3 or 4 years, hoping that something would happen, because American attention was diverted to Iraq, very little active policy in terms of bringing improvements to Afghanistan was carried out.
Sitting here today, what would you like to see taking place in Afghanistan?
What I would like to see is an Afghan people capable of handling its own affairs. And right now we're really on the cusp of this, because the military action can neither win nor lose the war, but it can change the environment in a way that would allow this major change to come about that will be self-sustaining. And that's what we really have to ask ourselves. Are the changes that we're helping to bring in, are they acceptable to the Afghan people, and are they self-sustaining? And at that point, I think we can get out in a way that will allow Afghanistan to be stable and its own people feel that they've left the generation-long nightmare that began in 1978.
Do you think that new generation of Afghans has a solid vision for what their future could look like or should look like?
The majority of the population in Afghanistan today was born after the Soviets withdrew. And yet every leader that we deal with earned his reputation, grew up, was affected by that particular period. In other words, they're caught in a particular time warp. And this new generation of Afghans wants to see something new happen. How they want to, where they want to go, what they're thinking, I'm not sure, but it's quite different than their elders, and in part the thing that they would like to see broken is the stranglehold of this generation, which they see as having taken Afghanistan into this disaster and is sitting on Afghanistan to this day. And of course, time will bring that about, but whether it will happen sooner as opposed to later, we really don't know. But I think when that new generation comes up, we will be seeing a different face of Afghanistan, and to some extent from my own experience there, I think a much more hopeful and positive generation of Afghans.
Dr. Barfield, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.